Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, we're taking time off for the holidays, so we reached into the Chatter archives for one of our favorite episodes. In January 2022, Shane Harris and I co-hosted John Sipher, a former senior intelligence officer who has gone Hollywood, to discuss our favorite spy movies, the fine line between the espionage and the action-adventure genres, and the kinds of stories we'd like to see more of. Enjoy this episode and happy holidays.
John Sipher, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are here in the studio, and this is a first, by the way, that David Priess and I are together in the studio doing an episode.
A joint interview. It's been done before, I understand, but
it's
not
happened.
on Chatter.
Not
You
on
guys
this
are going to
podcast.
team up on me. So the plan
Totally.
originally, I think, was to have Alex Finley on as
Yes.
well. So a couple ops officers against a couple nerds, and we had a chance
Ooh.
of actually winning that.
Well, I
But
tell you
now-
what.
now I'm going to get destroyed.
You just disappointed everybody because they wanted to hear from Alex, and now they've got you. But but I
Really
tell
set
you,
yourself up for a
I
win.
know what she was going to say, so I can just
she
channel
could not
her.
join us, unfortunately, at the last minute. So Shane and I have committed to have her back on another
Yeah,
time.
she'll come back on.
But we have
Sorry
the
about
pleasure
that.
of having
She's
you,
funny.
John, and we're going to talk to you about a whole bunch of things, and we can always make fun of Alex along the way, and she can respond in her episode.
in her tweets. I like this idea, though, that we should reframe this rather than as like the two ops officers take on the geeks. I think it should be the ops officer and the analyst, moderated by the journalist.
We could do that, but what we've discovered over time, John and I co-wrote an article a couple of years ago around the time of the Helsinki debacle with Trump. We actually agree on a whole lot more than we disagree on. So we will publicly spar just to have some fun over the traditional tropes of analysts and operators. But more often than not, we see eye to eye on things, which isn't as fun as picking on Shane Harris. So I think the two of us should game up.
Well, I try
game
not
up
to
on him.
admit it, but when I came into the agency, I came in to be an analyst.
Is that right?
Yeah, I did.
How did you get converted to the dark side
So
or
when
the
I
light?
came out
if
of
you
graduate
like?
school, I applied to the agency and applied to the State Department and a number of other places. I had worked at State INR as an internship between 2 years when I was up in graduate school. And, back then when you went interviewed, they would try to interview and talk to you about joining the clandestine service, the sort of espionage side organization, but they wouldn't tell you much. And so I was asked these questions, and I was like, listen, I know what analysts do. I might do this for a few years and go get a PhD or something. So I got it. But then it was when I came in, I guess my testing had all said I could do either, which was lucky because there were some people in the class that wanted to switch and they didn't
Right.
let them switch over.
Right.
And so I never actually worked as an analyst. I came in and sort of learned more about the agency. I didn't think I wanted to spend my career overseas. And as I came in and, friends were inside or in the sort of the spy side of the business, I moved over, and then 30 years later I was out.
So do you fill out a form? I mean, how do you do that? How do you switch?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to try to remember back. So, yes, you have to go through some sort of process, and they actually have to make a determination whether you can do it. And so, as David knows, when you come in, there's you take every possible bizarre test and psychological thing, and so there's some sort of assessment whether they think you can do one or the other. And so, I was able to do it without much pain.
It is also varied over the CIA's history. Sometimes it's very clear you are hired for this track, that's what you're in, and then once you've done it for a while, you can cross over. Sometimes there have been times in training where people are brought in together and they have all the initial training together, and then at the end of that process, they select which route they're going to take. And that's where you can have people like John Brennan who can say, well, I was brought in and, learned the operations at the beginning, and then I became an analyst, because that was during one of those periods, I believe, when there was that joint training initially for some of the fundamentals to be taught to everyone.
He's lying to you. He came through to go through the ops course and failed the ops course, and therefore had to become an analyst.
Still took it, though.
Yes, he did.
Still took the course.
A certain portion of it or whatever.
Yeah.
But
It's like when someone say they were enrolled at Harvard. They're not saying they got
he
a
did
degree.
much better, frankly, than if he had been a crappy ops officer. He did much better going the route he did. And yes, you're right. It's changed over time. I taught at the farm, and sometimes, different categories would be down there going through. Sometimes they would change it so they went through part of it. Sometimes, you'd have to go through this real formal process to change what you want to do. And I think 9/11 changed a lot of that because, very quickly analysts and reports officers and ops officers all really had to sort of work together because they were trying to do something we haven't done before.
Well, we're going to talk about your career post-CIA and spies going to Hollywood, and you have been working in Hollywood and talking to Hollywood types. But just for everyone to get situated before we do that, give us the highlights of your career. Most people, I think, probably who know you and know your writing now and who follow you on social media know about your career history in Russia and on Russia issues. But kind of give us the synopsis of your time in the agency.
Well, sure. Well, like I said, I came in to originally be an analyst, switched over into the espionage side of the house. It used to be called the Director of Operations, and then the Clandestine Service, and I think it's Director of Operations again.
Right, they went back.
As things do in the bureaucracy. And so I spent most of my career overseas. My first assignment was back when the Cold War was on and the Soviet Union existed, and I took a year of Finnish language to go to Finland and was in Finland for 3 years when the wall came down and when the Baltic states were moving out from under the Soviet Union. And so it was a fascinating time to be there, and then came back and took Russian and went to Moscow for a couple of years. It's a whole different sort of kettle of fish how you operate in those different places, and we can talk about that, but we also don't need to. And then as the Balkan Wars were going on, I went then to Belgrade in Yugoslavia and worked down there for several years, went back into our training center, training new officers to come into the clandestine service, and then went to, I was the deputy of our Russia house, our Russia group that does our sort of worldwide Russian espionage operations, Moscow plus everywhere in the world where we try to target and follow Russian issues. And then went back to Belgrade after the war, after the bombing, which was a bizarre and crazy thing. And then I worked domestically, a tour in the United States with the FBI. And when I was in Russia group, I worked a lot with the FBI on counter-espionage issues. I was there for the Hansen arrest, among other things. And the illegals, running of the illegals that were arrested in 2010. And then I went to Jakarta, Indonesia, after being the deputy of our organization at our headquarters that runs the domestic operations, working with the Bureau and Department of Energy and business leaders and such, and then to Pakistan before I retired.
What was it like being in Russia House after the Soviet Union had just fallen? Like, the main enemy is dead. So, like, you're working in the beating heart of operations against the main enemy, but they're gone.
Well, so I was in Moscow right after sort of the Soviet Union had fallen. And, looking back, what's interesting about that is that the special services, security services, the KGB, if you will, didn't really fall and change. And so, what we see now with Vladimir Putin, the reason sort of he and his cronies have stayed in power is because they knew where the money was. They were running the illicit networks overseas, the smuggling networks, the banking, all of those type of things. And so they essentially maintained their power. And so it was funny, in the early 90s working in Moscow, everybody had these hopes things were going to change, and it was a wild west, and American businessmen and finance people were running in there, and young guys were coming in to go after Russian women and blah, blah, blah. It was a crazy time. But the security services, the KGB operations against us and against the embassy didn't change at all. So our surveillance, and it's not hyperbole to say, we had surveillance 24 hours a day. It was followed everywhere we went. People tracked behind us, had our houses bugged, video, audio, games played against us. Everybody we talked to would be then interviewed and tried to be played back against us. That stuff didn't change at all, even though the rest of the society was going through rapid change.
Which is fascinating because you talk to diplomats from that time. If they served in Moscow in the 70s and 80s, and then they came back in the mid-90s, that was a different ballgame for them because they were actually having interactions with their counterparts. They were hosting visits in the United States. They were able to travel more in the Russian Federation than they had been in the Soviet Union. But with the station, it was still largely the same game.
Well, and it's true. They were talking to all sorts of people and traveling, but they were also being followed. They just weren't trained to know whether they were being followed. And so, it depends what the intention was of that. The Russians are very sort of cynical and conspiratorial, and therefore never sort of gave up that interest in those things. So it was a fascinating time, and there was real chances for change, and there's a variety of things that sort of changed that. But ultimately, when sort of an ex-KGB officer came back in and brought his sort of power ministry people back in around him, that sort of solidified.
Did you know that when Putin came back into power, knowing his background, did you think, oh yeah, this is going to backslide? Was that the tell for you?
I don't think so. Well, early on there was a few things. Because then I was at our headquarters Russia group at the time when he came back in, and there was a couple things that were really interesting because he was and worked in espionage like we did. there were some things that upset him, or he would call Clinton or he would call the President of the United States to yell about some low-level spy case. And you can just imagine those phone calls where our president's like, I don't even understand what you're talking about. But to Putin, these were like, really important and really angered him. And so, yeah, essentially, you take the guy out of the service, but you can never take the service out of the guy.
It does seem like that's the caricature of him too, which is largely accurate. That he's still he's a career spy in that way. So, yeah. So then, okay. So tell us what you're doing now. I mean, you go and how do you get from leaving the agency to then working with people who are creating fictional portrayals of the life that you lived for your entire career, and probably more often than not, getting it wrong.
Well, that's right. Well, like any career, it goes through sort of weird machinations. So when I left the agency, a lot of people, when they leave the agency, they just change the color of their badge and they come back and do contract work. But you don't have to do all the management and stuff that's often painful as you become a more senior.
You don't have to write performance reviews anymore, John.
Exactly. And have hard discussions with people saying, you're not allowed to, whatever. As I drink this rye, well, I might have better stories. But
there's a whole lot of people who do that simply, turn around, come in, and it's consulting. Maybe it's advising on an operational plan. Maybe it's helping with training. But they're doing largely the same work. But
often lower level. So essentially,
Right.
and you don't have a choice of where and what you're doing. So it's just, nothing special about what I wanted to do. It's just that a lot of my friends and people that I had grown up with, in Moscow and all these other places, had gone off to do sort of business kind of stuff, outside, to not stay doing contract work for the intelligence community. And so for some reason, when I came out, that's sort of where I was aiming. And I ended up quickly getting a job with McChrystal Group, with Stan McChrystal's consulting group, which does, essentially leadership training and these things with companies, not any government work. And I did that for a while, and that company actually split, and I went with a part of it that was doing software things. And, good people, interesting stuff. I learned a lot, worked with a lot of, big companies and things, but it wasn't that interesting to me. I sort of missed the content. I missed the stuff that you guys do. I missed talking about issues and that kind of stuff. So, as Trump started to run for president and there was a lot of the stuff related to Russia, I found myself having a little bit of a role talking about that. And what does that mean? People would, they'd see stuff, the Steele dossier came out and they're like, what does this mean? This is crazy. Well, the things that they're alleging actually do happen. Whether they happen to Trump or not, remains to be seen. We don't know. It depends on the sources, blah, blah, blah. So I started doing a little bit of writing and moved on from doing that kind of consulting.
And as I recall, John, your role then, maybe consciously or not, but your role then was largely explainer-in-chief. You weren't political. You weren't partisan. You were just saying, this is what I can say about the business to illuminate all of this stuff that's in the news that we never thought would be in the news, and shedding some light from your operational experience, right?
Yeah, and that was my intention. You guys both know that because you work in the thing. But inside, it's so non-political in the organization.
Yeah.
Like, I worked with people for 30 years, day in and day out, in all kinds of crazy situations. No sense of what their politics are until they retire, and then you see them on Facebook. You're like, oh my God, I had no idea that he's this or that. And so, over time, as I've started to comment on things and on Twitter, I'm definitely showing more of a political bent because I've been out for a while, and it's just the nature sort of the business. But my goal was, to try to explain what it's like to work as a public servant in, the intelligence community. And so I did that for a while. And interestingly enough, sort of my taste into sort of the Hollywood stuff where I've moved is I was sitting home one day and I get this phone call from Rob Reiner. So I'm honest, out of the blue, I'm sitting home, but John, this is Rob Reiner. And I'm like, come on. Be like All in the Family, Rob Reiner. Yeah. And of course, as Trump started to come in, he was all, Rob Reiner's a, classic sort of Hollywood liberal, was upset about the Russia stuff. And he says, listen, I want to do a video about Trump and Russia and what that all means with you and General Hayden and Clint Watts. And I'm going to come to Washington, and I want to do this thing. And I said, yeah, of course, that'd be great. And so we did. He came, and he has a website about Trump-Russia stuff that he put these videos up on. But then subsequent to that, I was with a bunch of friends. Several friends had retired from the agency, and we were at a bar drinking and sort of telling our stories of daring do and, semi-lies and things. And one guy was saying, it's always funny when we have these discussions. Everybody sits with us, years later will be like, God, that was the craziest thing. Listen to you guys with these stories of farce and screw up and so one of my friends who had retired, in his last job, he was the chief in Berlin, who's a great sort of storyteller, did a lot of stuff in counterterrorism, was in Afghanistan on the horses and the whole bit. I started sort of bragging about how I knew Rob Reiner and this and that, and we just got to talking and said, hey, there's a lot of weird sort of charlatans from the intelligence community that show up in Hollywood and stuff. We ought to try to see if we can't do something. And our original idea was to do some sort of Anthony Bourdain type of show where instead of talking about food, we would travel the world and tell spy stories, existing sort of, go to Vienna and find a spy bar and drink and tell, this is what happened here, that's what happened there. And as we started that process and we were going out to talk to people in Hollywood, we met a number of contacts, and some people said, hey, there would be an interest in what you guys are doing in the scripted side of the world too. So not just, unscripted Bourdain kind of thing, but there's a lot of writers that would like to work with you guys, and sort of one thing led to another, and we created a company called Spycraft Entertainment to try to become producers and work with writers and with production companies and the like to make movies, the content side of it.
Go back half a step, if you
Sure.
will. So you said as you were starting to think through this and explore it, there are the charlatans and there's different ways of former intelligence officers to engage with the creative arts. Talk to us about that spectrum. Is it, a former officer flying in for a day, sitting on a movie set, advising people how to load a weapon because they had firearms training at the farm? Or is it you are writing, producing, directing, and acting in your own film? Where in that spectrum did you learn that there are intelligence officers operating, and how did that get you to Spycraft Entertainment as your choice on that spectrum?
Well, I didn't have the vocabulary for that until I started working with a lot of people out there. But that first thing that you mentioned, where people come out sort of to an existing movie set or an existing story and, help them say, okay, what does the office look like? What color is the badge? These type of things. That's called consulting. And in sort of the Hollywood parlance, that's the lowest rank. So there's, a director, and then there's producers, and there's writers, and there's the people who do all the filming, and a lot of that is actually unionized. And then there's consultants that come in and sort of a day rate to do that type of stuff. And early on, we learned that sort of we wanted to work more on the creative side, to sort of become production, to work with the writers from soup to nuts, to sort of build a story and then pitch that story to production houses that have relationships with buyers and that type of stuff, and sort of stay away from consulting. But we can always provide consultants because we have a lot of people, friends and others that worked in the intelligence community and military community that can do that type of work. But let me give you an example. So, one of the stories we told early on was of a colleague of ours who spent a lot of time working on Iran and in the Middle East and rose to a very senior sort of rank. And there was a number of agency people that had sort of worked around the edges of Homeland. And a couple of them even showed up on screen a little bit, and they were sort of doing consulting work. And this officer sat down. He had just retired, and he sat down with some of the folks working on Homeland as they were sort of into their second or third season, and started talking about his career and experiences, and essentially mapped out an entire not episode, what's sort of
like a season arc.
Season arc for Homeland, which essentially they did. And then afterwards,
those are usually pretty expensive.
Oh my goodness! And then afterwards, we were saying, "Oh my gosh, you did that. What'd you get for that?" He goes, "Well, I had dinner with Mandy Patinkin." And we're like, "Well, at least you got a free dinner." And he goes, "Well, actually, I paid for the dinner."
What?
And so Hollywood is.
By the way, knowing who this officer is, I'm curious which one of them was able to get a word in edgewise, Mandy Patinkin or him, because they are both talkers.
Oh my God! Yeah, that's an excellent point.
It's funny you mention it that way, John, because I've talked to a couple of officers, and I have not done that kind of consulting on any films yet, although maybe the right one will
Yeah,
come
I'll
along.
get you in. Don't worry.
But I know an officer who has consulted on a couple, and he said there is a range there, that one of them, basically it was fly out to Hawaii or whatever it is for the filming, talk to them, but it's basically on your own dime. You just do it as a gift to the studio. And then the other one was not quite red carpet, but it was, oh yeah, we'll fly you out, business class, first class. We'll give you this nice meal. You get to hang out with the crew for a couple of days, and we'll pay you this much a day. So there's some range there,
of course.
But it wasn't what captured you. You didn't want to be that guy who would just occasionally pop in, give some advice, which they would take or wouldn't take.
Yeah, and I think that's fun, and I think people want to do that. Just it's sort of dip your foot in, meet some stars, do that type of thing. There's no reason not to do that type of stuff. But as we built in and started to talk to people, we realized there was more we could do. We ended up hooking up with a management company. So there's agents and management companies, and there's this whole sort of world of people in Hollywood doing these things who started introducing us to Hollywood writers. And
the ones that they represented, you mean?
The ones they represented. And then, we would talk to them about stories that, we were involved in, we knew, eventually, old spy stories, some of which there were books. And that sort of morphed into us starting to build our own stories. They call treatments. You put together anything from a 2 to 40-page sort of thing of what a story is. We put all that through the agency review board, so there's nothing classified.
Oh, that's interesting. They sign off on the treatments too.
Yes, they do.
Wow.
Yeah.
But that gives you the freedom to go forward with the treatments.
Well, and to be clear too, a treatment, just so people understand, is never intended to be published.
Right.
So the publication review board is reviewing material that's not actually going to be made public.
Point. Maybe we'll stop.
I'm not sure.
sharing.
You should talk to your lawyer about
But we
that.
do want the agency to know that at least in that process, we're not walking in and like wowing them with like secrets and things. We don't need. Frankly, the people they're interested in characters, stories, things that would interest an audience. They're not interested in the names of our sources or something that's going to cause damage to national security. They're that's not the game anyway, and so it's not really a problem. And so we created a number of stories that we lived through. When I say we, my main partner is Jerry O'Shea. He was the guy I said was in Germany, and he'd been the chief in Baghdad, and he'd been in Afghanistan on the horses, and he'd been in Zimbabwe. He was like a hippie growing up, smoking dope in Afghanistan, got thrown in jail in like 1978 in Iran.
Sounds like
and
a
all this.
movie itself. Yeah,
he's a crazy and fascinating individual. And so we're sort of putting together these stories, and also then we're optioning books. So if an interesting book comes out that has an espionage story, we'll option that, and then we'll try to find writers who then want to take that and translate that into a TV series or into a movie. And so we're doing a wide variety of those things. We have kids shows and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Question kind of like spring off of going back to the conversation about Homeland, because so this officer goes out there and, frankly, I mean, I'll just say what I think, is taken advantage of. Like, they sit him down, he writes basically a season arc, they give him nothing. And this is a fairly typical story in Hollywood where people will just rip off material and they'll take it. They'll, inspiration books that have become inspirations for TV shows, and the authors never see a dime of it. So when you went out there, I mean, how did you guard against that, knowing that, like, yes, you're the cool spy who's come in, and they're going to be like, oh, you're just you got these great stories, John, and oh, it's so awesome. But you're in their world, and what they want is what's in your head, and they want to pay you the least amount of money they have to give it to you. Yeah. So then you get the idea, though, to turn it around and form your own production company. So, I mean, what was your impression when you got out there, and did you think, like, there's actually a better way to do this? We should just start our own company and not be just beholden to these people, some of whom, to be clear, will pay gobs of money for consultant work and do it honorably. But, was there a moment where you said, like, no, I can see how they're playing this. We should just get a step ahead and do it ourselves?
Well, luckily, Jerry and I, we ran into a guy who had worked with a couple of other agency seniors in, he was sort of an entrepreneur and worked on cybersecurity with a number of agency people. And his sort of take was like, you guys always get taken advantage of. Like, you guys are all more talented and smarter, and all these businesses sort of take advantage of you. And he lives out there, has worked in Hollywood, has had some companies where he's sold things to Sony and worked with them on a variety of things. And so he early on sort of like took a hold of us, said, dudes, here's how this works.
Yeah.
You guys need to, have a company here, you need to be producers, and so we had a little bit of a tutorial up front to say this is the way to go, as opposed to just being wowed by showing up on a set and a Hollywood set, and
right,
so
which they know works. Yeah,
and once you meet writers and creative types, it's really fun, and if you can be a value add where they see, like, I don't just need you for one thing to give me some ideas, I want to work with you over time to build this story, build these characters, build this world. We found that most people are pretty up and willing to work with us, and writers don't really lose any money by working with us as producers, because writers are part of a union and they're sort of get a certain amount for a script, or whether or not it gets made, and those type of things. And so we found that sort of working with people through the entire process has been beneficial. Now, one of the things that makes it, we're sort of learning the process is we're going sort of the long way to get there to have shows made, and money doesn't come until something gets bought by a
What do you
distributor
mean the long
made.
way? Like you're creating the content idea and then finding the money?
Well, what you do is you work with a writer, you build a story, and then you might go to a larger production company that has an existing relationship with a buyer, like with a Netflix or an HBO or what have you. And then you talk to them. They then agree to pay the writer to do the full script. In other words, you pitch them. They like the idea. You work with them. You decide you're going to work together. They then pay the writer to do a full script, and then you go to potential buyers. You go to the Netflixes, you go to the HBOs, and some of them have relationships. And then they say yay or nay. Then you do a deal saying you're going to get paid this much for each episode, blah, blah, blah. But you don't actually get paid until then it's made and sold to a distributor who's going to then put it out. And of course, what's happening with the industry is going through all kinds of changes, right? So there used to be sort of a way of doing business. There was movie theaters, there was movies. Nowadays, there's so much streaming. It's all sort of changed. There's still big money in network TV, which is generally awful, but more eyeballs see
Tons
that
of
than
people watch it.
anything else. And so, if you can create a show that one of these shows is CSI, Blue Bloods kind of shows that goes forever, you're sort of writing your ticket.
What did you have in mind when you were first envisioning this and talking? So you set up the business side, right? You set up the legal construct and do all that administrative stuff that you probably had to do in a station and running running an operational unit. But on the content, were you thinking full-length feature films primarily, or were you thinking, yes, develop an actual TV series like you just mentioned?
So there's sort of three ways to go. There's films, movies. There's streaming series, which most of us tend to watch now because it's sort of, and then there's network TV. And like I said, streaming series, some of that stuff is incredibly well done, and writers like that because they can take characters and content and drag it out and actually tell a story in a much better way than you might be in 2 hours. And so there's shows, we talk about espionage shows. What's the famous one with De Niro years ago? Good Shepherd, right?
Oh, yeah.
Telling the early stories of the craziness of the CIA. But they tried to squeeze 30 hours of content into a 2.5-hour movie, and it was sort of a failure.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays you can drag that out
That
and
would be
tell it in
serious,
30
yeah.
hours, right?
Yeah.
And so, and there's a lot of interest in those kind of things. But of course, less people see them than they see a network show. And so, we're sort of trying to work in all three areas, doing movies and it sort of depends on sort of the content, the idea. So if we talk it through, and someone will say, "Do you see this as a movie?" And it's like, yeah, it could be a movie. But you can also, if you look at it this way and tell more of the story, it could be a streaming series. And
Are people in Hollywood trying to channel you into picking one lane, or are they okay with the fact that you're playing in all of those different possible lanes and whatever works is great?
No, we haven't had anybody trying to do that, and we're starting to get some success and get things bought in each of those areas. Now, of course, since we're new, it's a little bit harder. In terms of how much you might get per episode and those type of things. You sort of need to get something out there where people see and go, oh, this is really quality, and people want to come to you. So I said some of the production houses we work with them because they have a relationship with buyers, HBO, Hulu, whatever. Now, we want to get to a point where where Netflix says, okay, we want you to work with us. We'll pay you a certain amount of money per year to keep your company going, but we get first look at everything you do.
Yeah, you get an exclusive deal.
Yeah, and then of course, if it doesn't, then you can move it on to other places. And so we've been lucky. We've got to work with some really sort of high-end writers and producers and sort of big shots. And so it's been a lot of fun. But we still don't have anything that you can watch on.
Well, can you
on
talk?
TV.
Are you allowed to talk about any of the projects that are in development, so to speak, or is it all still hush hush?
I don't think it's hush
Is
hush.
it still top secret?
We have we have a couple shows with Apple. We have one. There's a lot of interest in sort of on the espionage side about families and how do people sort of live overseas in this world. And so we have one. It is essentially a teen or kids show with Apple about a group of young kids who come back from overseas. Their parents are intelligence officers, and they become witting. In other words, that's when at some point in a kid's life, you as a CIA officer, you might tell your kids, okay, here's really what mom or dad do for a living, and if we go back overseas, you need to help protect that cover and this type of thing. And so it's sort of a Goonies type of story where these kids come back, they go, the parents take them to family day at the CIA, which David could talk about, and then they learn what their parents do, and then of course they start doing their own little, trying to uncover stuff and
There's
tell
some
stories.
really
That's good. I
you
like
can get
that.
to some great personal dynamics there. That gives you some real creative
Oh,
opportunities.
there's a lot you can work with there. Absolutely. About how kids see that. What they have to do overseas. Are they mature enough to handle this? You're actually asking them to handle something that could be dangerous. Obviously, if you're back overseas in terms of protecting and not saying things to their friends and that type of stuff, are they mature enough to do that? So we're doing that. We have another one also. We're working with Apple with Gidi Roth, the writer that did the original Homeland, and he did The Spy with Sacha Baron Cohen and some other shows. So my colleague Jerry lives in Hawaii and started doing some research about it's fascinating. There was a Nazi in 1930s Germany who was essentially, his daughter was screwing Goebbels, and it became sort of an internal Nazi party, problem, potential problem. And so Hitler essentially went to the father and said, listen, if you can go away for a while to let this settle down, it would be a good thing.
Interesting. He didn't go to Goebbels. He went to the father of.
Yeah, exactly.
That says a lot.
Yeah, it does say a lot. And, they were Nazis. And he actually went to Hawaii. And so in Hawaii, in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, you had this white German guy who the Japanese realized was a real benefit to them and started spying for the Japanese to prepare for Pearl Harbor. And because he was a white German guy, he had access to all sorts of senior Navy and Army Americans and started providing all sorts of information about, what was happening in those places. And his wife started a hairdresser place where all the wives would come back, and it's like, oh, my husband's coming in on the Arizona this weekend and I need my hair to look good. And then they would pass this information about the Japanese about when ships were coming in and out. He was actually arrested by the FBI on December 8th, 1941, the day after. Ooh. And so we built a story, true story, and we went through a lot of the old FBI files to try to put that together. That's another kind of story, as well as movies related to, some of the stuff that happened, in Iraq with Yazidi sex slaves and, so we have movies, streaming shows, and then of course if we can create one of these sort of they call it sort of episode of the day or story of the day for network TV. That would be a great thing too.
It sounds like you're talking about stories that have happened at all different historical periods, parts of the world. It sounds like the appetite for this material is pretty diverse.
So, for example, we've optioned a book called Betrayal in Berlin, which is a fantastic book about an author named Steve Vogel, whose father was a CIA officer. Mm-hmm. And it's about, in the 1950s, if you recall, sort of the beginnings of the CIA. Eisenhower was like, listen, all I need the CIA to do is give me 24 hours notice of when the Soviets might attack in Germany or come across the border. And we had we had no sources in the Soviet Union or in the West, and had no sense of, we could easily be overrun in West Germany or in Europe. And there was sort of this Hail Mary where our Berlin station decided to do this crazy idea of actually digging a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin and tap into the Soviet and East German phone lines, both classified, both encrypted and non-encrypted. And it's a fantastic story of how they did that and the success it had. But of course, it was undercut by a British SIS intelligence officer who's a fascinating story in his own right, who ended up being a British intelligence officer in Korea when North Koreans invaded. And Korea was taken prisoner, brought to North Korea, was in the prison camps for several years. But while he was there, became an avid communist and agreed to spy for the Soviet Union. George Blake, his name was. And after the Korean War, he was seen as a hero, was brought back into the service, and he was in Berlin and knew about this process and was passing it on to the Soviets. But the Soviets they needed to protect that source so well because it was giving them incredible information that they essentially allowed the tunnel to continue, thinking that their security and the military security would be good enough that it wouldn't cause much problems. Sort of unbeknownst to them, they were wrong. It was really fascinating. So we're working with the writer, the guy who did Field of Dreams and Sneakers and a number of other things to try to take that book and turn it into a streaming series, for example. That's the kind of thing we're working on.
Do you find that when you approach a writer, and these are people who've obviously, they've had their own careers as writers and probably written lots of different things. I mean, you just mentioned two diverse films right there. Do they come in with preconceived notions about how the world of espionage and intelligence works that you kind of have to correct? Or do they come into it more with like a blank slate and like, I'll just soak it up. You tell me like how this is supposed to feel and look and like what's authentic and what's not.
Sort of both. And you know, I really enjoy, one of the things I like doing this type of stuff after having worked in the agency is it's fun to work with creative people. And that's essentially why you guys are doing what you do too, right? You're interested in the content, you're interested in the issues, you're interested in working with smart people. And this is different from our previous job. But you know, the writers, they're really sharp, they're really good, they're looking to tell good stories and get them told, and they're looking to create worlds that they can then move forward. Some of them are really sort of wannabes, interested. They've read a lot of stuff, they're interested, and we just sort of need to work with them to aim, where might go. Others are just willing, don't know much, but they sort of think they want to put something in that world. And so, for example, young writer, not really well known. He's on a number of shows. Sort of had a general idea. He wanted to write something sort of like The Sopranos, right? So The Sopranos is a family story, but they happen to be, mafia people, right? The mafia is sort of the secondary part of the story. And he wanted to do something. He had some ideas for how to do a story, some characters, but he wanted to put it in an overseas CIA station world. And so one of our colleagues we work with was one of the most senior women in the clandestine service for years and years, came in early on when there wasn't many women doing this through the nasty days where men were treating them very poorly and stuff. She lives now in Oklahoma. And so we brought the writer out and sat at her house for 3 or 4 days, just walking through stories of what it was like in this place, that place, what's it like with your family, how do you think about operations, how do you think about operating, in this environment and that environment. And essentially, he's a young writer. We don't mind spending the time with him. We didn't have, big expectations that would come of it. He wrote an amazing pilot episode and several episodes since that were just incredible. And we've been talking with, some very high level. It's about a female officer overseas. People like Kate Winslet and others to play this role. And we've gotten some, sort of big time producers that would be interested in doing this.
What about the flip side? Because we have something in the book writing environment now that we didn't have decades ago, which is plenty of former intelligence officers writing fiction. So instead of working with a Hollywood writer who thinks they have a good story that involves intelligence, and then you tell them what they got wrong, and you mutually decide, do we want to keep it wrong because that's more entertaining? Now you have a bunch of officers out there writing fiction, including David McCloskey, who's been on this podcast. Yep. So are you interested in exploring that because it actually makes your work quite a bit easier than working with a raw writer and turning it into gold?
No, absolutely. So that's sort of it's all about IP, intellectual property. Mm-hmm. So intellectual property could be our stories that we put into a treatment that we then work with a writer on. Mm-hmm. It could be a book, a podcast, an article.
Shane, I think I see where he's going here. This is Chatter the movie.
Yeah,
there you go.
And there's a number of podcasts and things that are now being made into shows and stuff.
Sure.
And
Wind of Change by my friend Patrick Radden Keefe was a great
on
one.
That.
That's right, you are in that. That's right, yeah.
Which is funny. I had no idea what he was, doing, but I did this interview, and several years later, all of a sudden it shows up, and it's like, oh, that's interesting.
The question of whether the CIA actually wrote the song "Wind of Change" by the Scorpions, which was the Cold War anthem. Yeah, but that's a great example.
I've talked to a lot of CIA officers who don't know the answer either.
Right, exactly. But I know other journalists too who are getting approached to do long-form narrative podcast in the way that they would have been approached 5-10 years ago. To write a longer book based off an article or to turn their article into a screenplay.
Yep.
And podcast is now just another format.
Yeah, and David McCloskey's a friend. His new novel is fantastic. We're trying to option it, but of course...
Everyone wants to option it.
Yeah, his people, you talk to them, they're like, harumph, we'll wait and see. Like, okay, fine. You and there's also a game that goes on there. So like all sorts of articles and books get picked up in options, essentially for like British writers. BBC buys them all up, but then does nothing with the great majority of them. Mm-hmm. And what we're hoping to do is get enough of a brand and respectability that we work in the intelligence community space that if we're promoting a book, it's worth talking to us to go forward. So there's unfortunately most of these things never make it past, and you hear stories of authors. There's a guy who wrote a book on Jim Nicholson, who was a CIA spy that got arrested, and then in prison recruited his son to continue spying with the Russians, which is a fantastic story. And I was talking to the author just last week about, hey, we'd like to work this. And he's like, yeah, let me tell you the story of what happened. It was originally, they came in and De Niro and all these people were going to do this movie, blah, blah, 2 years of talk and nothing happened. And then, optioned to somebody else and all this talk and then nothing happened. And so, he's sort of trying to write his own script now to see if he can get that made. I think it would be a great, and we're going to try to work with him. And so yes, we want to look for any kind of book, any kind of IP that is worth doing. And there's the thing is, once we have this brand and people start coming to us instead of us trying to, we can then point people to hundreds of fantastic books, hundreds of fantastic stories, stuff that there's been books on but out of print or people have forgotten. Look at some of the movies that have come out lately, Bridge of Spies. There's the Penkovsky movie with Cumberbatch. All these kind of things. Yeah. Those stories have been known for 70 years and nobody did a film. And then once they do it, there's all of a sudden there's interest.
Well, it's worth spending a second too, just on the vocabulary too, for listeners who don't know. When a work is optioned, it doesn't mean someone's going to make it. It just means that they're paying you to temporarily not sell it to anyone else. Right. And the option is usually, it can be a considerable amount of money, but it's not the kind of money when you sell the rights to something, and it's not a pittance, but it's enough to make you cool your jets for a little while. And it's that period that you're talking about where lots of big ideas and lots of big talk happens, and then most of the time nothing ever is consummated. And so I think that must be very frustrating. It's obviously very frustrating for writers, I know, but what you're proposing here is something different, where you want to be seen as like the place where when you seriously want to make good content, like these guys know where to go. And it's not just like, Spielberg has 3 things optioned and Tom Hanks optioned another submarine movie and this or that, but it's much more like organized and you have kind of more of an authority. Yeah,
there's a few downsides that are interesting. So like, one of the things you might want to do is obviously get a big time actor or something to sign on to your thing, and that can be really good, but it can also be a real problem because big time actors, say, I'm just making this up, Brad Pitt or someone signs on to your movie, but the problem is Brad Pitt signs on to 20 things. He can make 8 of them, and even though there's a lot of churn around, he's on your movie, like if he can't get to it timing, he can't do those type of things, and so there's sort of downsides to that piece. And what's interesting is some really crappy stuff gets made and in this space. And oftentimes early on, we'd be going to our sort of manager, our people we work in Hollywood and say, look, how in the world did this thing get made? And they say, well, there's different ways of working your way into it. If a big star reads a book and is enamored with the book, even if it's crappy, it'll get made. And so there's different ways in. And the thing is, we need to build the credibility and brand so that we're one of the known ways in, and so we're working there.
Do you find that? I mean, is it the stars who get enamored in these kinds of projects, or even the producers? Is it nostalgia that's driving them? Is it that spy movies are just inherently cool? I mean, like, what is the kind of thing that's always hooking them? Because I imagine they come into it too with an idea in their head of like, oh, I know what my favorite spy movie was, or like, I remember my favorite Bond movie. Like, so what is it usually that hooks them on the subject?
Well, there's a couple things. One is, I think there's been some sort of data or research that suggests actually spy movies do better, like in terms of box office and things. And so there's an interest sort of in that world. It is a world which is interesting where you can explore, betrayal and trust and all of these type of things. So it has to do, at the end of the day, with the human factor.
There are good plot points inherent to the genre, right?
It's international intrigue. It's, big issues around sort of personal decisions with, between a couple of different people. But part of the problem is, not a problem, is that, a lot of times espionage films get put in the action genre and the thriller genre because, with the shooting and the car chases and that type of stuff. And sometimes, it sort of goes away from, I think, a really good writer who could explore characters all of a sudden is now, interested in blowing stuff up. And the thing is, blowing stuff up makes money. And
teenage boys like to see things blown up.
And so we want to try to move into the sort of stories that are much more sort of human factor, dealing with sort of the issues of, between a source and a handler, for example, that type of thing.
And that seems would lend itself much more to the kind of prestige drama that is of interest to streaming services. So like, you mentioned Kate Winslet. So you take something like Mare of Easttown, which is fantastic. She's incredible. I would wager to say very few people saw that performance,
Right.
even though it's like the performance of the year by an actress. But it strikes me like when you're talking about like what's going to be like the dividing line between that show and the network show, and there's nothing wrong with this, but like the network show is probably going to be the one that's more about the visuals and about the sort of adrenaline and less about the characters, and that's just going to appeal to a broader audience. But this subject matter really can cut across all of them. We can all cite examples
exactly.
of that.
For example, oftentimes you'll talk about the network shows as case of the week, right? So you can imagine like, okay,
right.
so you're taking whatever it is, Blue Bloods or CSI. It's like once you've created a cadre of sort of characters that you think you're interested in, then every week can be a different. You know, they don't necessarily need to hold together. They,
Right.
And essentially in espionage, what we have is cases, like right. So if I can create
You've
a
got
group,
raw material there.
and we're trying to, whether it's something people haven't seen before, like agency lawyers, or whether it's the defection center of how they deal with all these people coming into a new country and their family didn't realize they were spying, this type of stuff. If we can create that world, and then we can just it's easy to then put together crazy cases to keep that going. But the streaming, is sort of. Writers are very interested in that now. Think about Chernobyl, which was incredibly popular.
Awesome.
Can you imagine trying to sell that, though? I can imagine them for years going and say, hey, we have this great idea, we're going to do Chernobyl. And they'd be like, oh, my God, could anything be more boring? We know what happened.
Depressing. Yeah.
The sort of Eastern Europe is depressing. Everybody knows what happens. But if something's done well, it's like the Wind of Change podcast. Like there's no story there. But when a story is told really well, to really good people, it draws you in.
Yeah.
And I think Chernobyl is a good example of that. It ended up being fantastic.
Yeah.
Series.
Wind of Change is a good example of this. And, Patrick has written stories like this and even books before where that podcast is essentially his reporting process. Like if you want, I would tell people too, like if you want to see how like a magazine writer writes a magazine article, just listen to that podcast because that's basically what he's doing. He's starting with a question. Did this song, this anthem of the Cold War, was it secretly written by the CIA as propaganda? Follow me, dear listener, as I seek to find whether the answer is, right? And like spoiler alert, you get to the end, it's like it's not really conclusive. But I think that there's something about this genre that's also it's mystery, right? I mean, a case is a mystery, and you as an intelligence officer are constantly trying to figure out why is this leader doing X? Who's behind this operation? And that is just like intrinsically humanly interesting, right? It's the same reason that the mystery genre is huge and will never die, or crime, exactly. And they're all like cousins of one another.
Yeah. And I mean, it's about telling stories and telling stories well.
Yes.
And there's different ways of doing that. In movies, COVID has really sort of changed how the industry works in terms of how distributors buy things, and a lot of theaters have gone out of business. Sort of that process where movies, so they tend to get made less, and some big movies have not done well. West Side Story essentially was a flop, even though it was incredible.
It's amazing. It's not taking off
for
at
example. But there's some stories, that really can be told in 2 hours. That really big sort of dramas and things. And then there's some stories that are better for each. And so that's part of the thing is finding the right venue.
Yeah, you're never going to run out of material, but like we have, it must be just very exciting too. I find it exciting as a creative person that there are just so many more outlets than there were before. And if you think of if we go back to thinking and we'll talk, some about our favorite and least favorite spy movies, but it used to just be the genre was just defined by the 90 to 120 minute film, right? I mean, there weren't spy TV. I mean, I guess there were some spy TV shows. Some of them were comedies, but we didn't have anything close to the explosion of content that we have now. It was relegated largely to feature films and books, and I guess newspaper articles too. But now it's a
good time to be. I'm getting old now, and I'm thinking at some point when I can't move and I'm sitting on a chair. What a great! When I grew up, you had 3 TV channels, and you could read. Now, when the time comes, when I'm completely, I can sit at and I can watch sports at my heart's content and every kind of streaming series. And the thing is, there's so much stuff out there, something you've never heard of, and a friend or Shane will say hey, have you looked at this? And you watch it, and you're like, oh my God, it's really good.
It's really good. Do you find so you opened the door to this? I didn't want to ask this indelicately, but you're entering a career after you've had a career, right? And so is that? I mean, it must be very exciting, but what's that been like? Sort of you're starting a new thing after you've done this big thing already, and and it's obviously. I mean, it's not. Hollywood is it's not entirely a young person's industry, but it's just there's a lot of churn.
Everything is a young person's industry.
Okay.
I mean, in many ways, and so I mean, For one, I left CIA completely satisfied with my career, and that's not always the case. A lot of people, are looking to become this or the director of this, that, and they're trying to move up the chain or whatever it is. And so a lot of very, very talented and good people leave upset or leave angry, which is unfortunate.
Or at least feeling incomplete, that they need to make their mark in something else.
Yeah, and I could have stayed. I probably would have loved staying. I loved every minute. I love living overseas. I love learning new cultures. I love learning new languages. I love dealing with foreigners. I love dealing with the issues of the day.
Long management meetings, writing performance reviews,
I grew up in a small town
budgets.
in upstate New York, so even that stuff's not that painful. So I have no regrets. And so what I like about this is just it's different, it's creative, it's fun. If it doesn't succeed, it's still fun. Now we've been lucky enough; we have a couple investors who are, sort of interested in the thing in this sort of area. They're giving us some money so we can pay ourselves at least enough so that our spouses aren't going to yell at us or whatever.
Okay, so it's worth your time.
Yeah, and then of course if it succeeds, then that's all to the good. But I'm not doing it because I need to have success. I need to validate myself. I need to make money. It's fun and it's creative, and if money comes out of it, great. And if success comes out of it, great. But I've already had a career which I loved and feel fulfilled through.
I want to follow up on that thing you just dropped there, which is investors. So don't want you to reveal who your investors are, but why would people invest in this? Because there's a lot of failure in this business. There's no guarantee that you're going to succeed because, like you said, you might get 20 different people showing interest in this and even having Brad Pitt scoop it up or Leonardo DiCaprio for his company scoop it up, and then it never gets made and the big money doesn't ultimately come through. Mm-hmm. What attracted your investors? Was it an interest in the raw material and wanting to see someone do it right? Or did they actually see that this could be a money-making venture over time?
Or they were dudes with a lot of money and thought this was cool.
Yeah. Well, I think Hollywood has lived off of that. They've lived off of people with a lot of money who are doing stuff, but working with Hollywood gives them that high, that like, oh my goodness, I can show up at this party, I can be this, I'm part of this.
I'm working with this guy, we're making a movie,
and so
Kate Winslet's interested.
Yeah, I've had a couple writers
basically Get Shorty,
that
right?
I've talked to, and they've done some cool stuff, these writers, and I'm like, how'd you end up doing that? And he's like, there is no better line than I'm making a movie. You can get anybody will give you anything or do anything and show you anything if you can say I'm making a movie. And so essentially there's that. So essentially our investors are people who, have made a lot of money, they're doing well. But I think of the many things they're doing, if this pays off and they can sort of have success in this area, it's just that extra thing. It's sort of cool. It's different. I think they do think there's a good chance of success. But you're right. It's not if you're one of these guys that needs a 10x, and I'm gonna invest and I expect it to be this much over this time and invest in Silicon Valley and stuff. Investing in Hollywood is it's a gamble. It's essentially a lottery ticket, right? So you're buying a lottery ticket, and it could pay off, but it's likely not to pay off. But if you're interested in that area and you sort of want to, be associating yourself with Hollywood and things, it might be worth it for you.
I want to ask you about one movie in particular, and what year did you leave the agency?
2014.
Okay, so I want to ask you about Zero Dark 30. Mm-hmm. And, putting aside for a second whether you like the film or not, I happen to think it's a great film. I really like it. I've rewatched it several times. But that movie generated a significant amount of controversy for the way that the CIA cooperated with the filmmakers, Catherine Bigelow and her writing partner. Talk about that. Do you have a view on that? I mean, the negative critique of it is that the CIA basically became enamored. This huge director came in that wanted to make this laudatory film about one of the great successes in the history of the CIA. So they basically just gave them tons of classified information and told them things they would never tell someone like me working as a journalist. And then, of course, the positive review of it might be, hey, they worked with a filmmaker to tell a story about, an incredibly significant moment in American history to make sure they got it right and that they had all the information they needed. Okay, where do you come down on this? Because it became a real controversy.
No, it did. And of course, they were dealing with a controversial thing as well. So our goal with this was, we were CIA officers who did love our work, and you loved working for the CIA. But our goal was not to make the CIA look good or make the CIA necessarily look bad. It was to tell interesting stories. And so we have cooperated with the CIA in the sense that we've let them know what we're doing. We put our stuff through to make sure that they're confident we're not giving away secrets and classified information. We sort of keep public affairs informed about that we're doing this, but we have nothing, there's no sort of deal, or we're not a movie that we're trying to do with them or get stuff from them. It's, maybe someday, but I don't think that is a way we want to or need to go. There are some things over the years that the agency has, there's the $1 Billion Spy, the book on Tolkachev. Mm-hmm. There's
Great
this
book.
new book about First Casualty, which is about the early teams that went into Afghanistan and the death of Johnny Spann. And as you read those, it's clear that either the agency supported them or supported some people that were involved in those issues talking to writers or movies and stuff. So, yeah, we're not looking to do that, and we don't need to at this point. I mean, it's sort of, there's plenty of content and stories out there without having to, sort of piggyback off of the agency.
What do you think about the way that they open the doors to Catherine Bigelow and those filmmakers?
It's funny. I watched that film early on. Didn't care that much about it. Sort of tangentially followed that issue. The Defense Department does this like as routine. Like they have people who work specifically on providing content and pushing movies and helping them.
And Top Gun is like, from my childhood, the most famous example.
Well, exactly.
And the FBI historically is famous for it.
And the agency essentially does it poorly. Has always done, for example, there was that movie Horse Soldiers about people going into, and essentially there's a number of these people who ended up talking to this book, First Casualty, which is pretty good, I think, who at the time said, hey, this movie's going to be made. It's really our story. It's not a military story. We should talk to them. And the agency said, absolutely not, absolutely not. Of course, then it comes out and they're like, oh, well, this was a missed opportunity. We could have done these kind of things. We're trying to avoid that whole thing. We're not interested in doing that. Yeah, whether the Zero Dark 30 working with the agency, yeah, I don't think they needed to. I'm not sure who made the decision and why. It does, everybody knew that the whole issue of enhanced interrogations and stuff was going to be problematic, and the government is usually poor at explaining background and situations, everything from Snowden to enhanced interrogation. If laid out properly, could at least make it clear to people what risks and decisions and why. Even if you disagree with them, you could at least understand it. And the agency's traditionally been crappy at that. So I don't know why at certain times they think, oh, we're going to jump in both feet on this one.
I think, I may have I think I do some insight on that question, which was that when the bin Laden operation went down, I mean, it was like there were a lot of people in the Obama administration very eager to talk to reporters right away.
Well, some of the things they said early on, but then others ended up hurting us.
I
worked in Pakistan, so I know that.
Well, there was a real, I think, push to very quickly, I'll use the overused term, but it works here, to solidify the narrative. Mm-hmm. Even down to the point where there were rich stories coming out within days about that were in the room when they shot bin Laden, and you're like, okay, hold on here. But there was a real rush for that, and I think that reflected on the part of the White House and the CIA military, understandably, a real desire to celebrate their success, that they had this, just extraordinarily successful operation, and they're like, get that story out there. It's a good story for us.
I think, and at that time, this movie was already moving along. I think it was meant to be a movie on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I think they'd already started.
That's right. Yeah, they weren't doing it.
So I think they were already down the road. They just switched it to become bin Laden story.
Right. The thing I do like about that movie, and maybe we can transition to talk about some movies, is is what it seemed to me to get. In addition to just, I love the way it's shot, and there's the tension of it, and the music, the score is just incredible too. It's really, really great.
And now I got to rewatch it. Okay.
It's good, but it's the way that it deals with the uncertainty of intelligence analysis, right? And so the Jessica Chastain character is sort of, I guess she's kind of a composite, but she's
definitely a composite.
Yeah, so she's driven, and she's but she's driven by a kind of an obsession, but also kind of a level of certainty that the other analysts around her don't really have. And there's the famous scene where she's sitting in the conference room with Panetta, who's played by the late James Gandolfini, and they're going around the conference room table saying, give me your confidence level that he's actually in the compound. And people are like, 50%, 70%. She's like, 100%. I know I'm not supposed to say it, so whatever, 99%, but it's 100. And I love this. It gets you to these whole, the way that the confidence levels are constantly just reflecting that it's always a we're not sure. Mm-hmm. And on that operation, this I thought they got really right, is at the end of the day, the president had to make the call to risk, many lives and an international incident by, on what was not a definitive answer. And that seemed to me like that part, they really played that out and made you feel like, I mean, obviously you know how it ends, so you know that he's 100% that he's there. But they get that tension.
But even it doesn't end, having been there after that. And Rebecca said the consequences of decisions like that play out over time. In terms of asking them for other help, of
like they're gonna find out we did it. Right.
And so it's interesting, and we do have people like that, and some of these are based on some real people that we know, and some of those real people aren't necessarily aren't the greatest and most wonderful people. That someone who can be really useful and good in one situation might be a real handling problem and management problem in another.
So I find myself thinking during this whole Zero Dark 30 conversation of pairing it with a very different way that the CIA handled an operation, if you will, and its cooperation with film and the time frame, which is Argo.
Yeah.
Here's a story that was also a great success that, just like the Abbottabad operation, could have within days or weeks, probably not within days or weeks because of some contingencies on the ground, but shortly thereafter could have been put out there and told. And it wasn't. It wasn't essentially declassified. I think George Tenet finally opened up the story
it was
of Argo.
a studies and intelligence article is what it was. So the sort of in-house.
Classified one. Yeah. But eventually that was
widely
opened up.
read. No.
Well, nothing in there is widely read. But
decades later, opened up. They allowed Tony to go out and start talking about it.
Right.
Suddenly
Tony
there's a
Mendez,
book. Suddenly there's a script. Suddenly there's a movie. I think overall a very good movie. Most people complain about the airport scene at the end, which was gratuitous and unnecessary. But overall, a good movie. But it had decades to percolate.
Yeah.
As opposed to the story of Abbottabad, which came out months.
But it was the story was known in Hollywood. It took 8 to 10 years to get it made, even after people started and knew about it. So I mean, there's when does something become declassified, or when does the agency get involved, and then there's how long it takes to make a show or movie. And there's tons of stories of fantastic movies that nobody wanted to buy, no one was interested in, and all of a sudden, years later, it gets made.
Somebody makes it.
Do you have an interest in that? Do you have an interest not in the story of, I'll say Spy Kids, although that's not where you're going with it, but the children of intelligence officers who discover that what their parents do, but do you have an interest in the true stories, the things like Argo so taking a story of some intelligence operation that was great, that hasn't been made into a film yet, and saying, okay, we will dramatize it a bit. We'll call it a based on story, but we know it's the real case.
Yeah, it's not the true story. It's not the truth in the story. It's the whatever. I'll mess up the way we say it, but there's you can tell a true story and still not share stuff that could do damage or security problems and that type of stuff. So yes, we're looking to do that, and there's tons of things that are already out there. I mean, you make your living off of this kind of stuff that if told in the right way, would really be interesting. And so, we're looking to tell real story. What we haven't done yet, and I don't know if we ever will, is get into like the documentary space, because the problem with when you get into documentaries, they just need to keep, like if you're a journalist, you're going to keep digging until you can't go any further, and that gets into potentially. Whereas what we can do now is we can tell the real story, can tell sort of the real feel, the real atmospheric, some basic things, but then sort of shave off pieces we know might be sensitive.
Well, you have that barrier.
But with a documentary, you can't do that. And frankly, documentaries are tough because you often have to raise money. They don't make much money.
Yeah,
so
at
this
a
point,
total grind.
And you do have that barrier of going through the publication review board, which is largely fine, and you've suggested that it's fine. But some of the most interesting potential true stories, whether made as a documentary or as a feature film or TV series, a lot of them revolve around some of the really interesting, whether it's technology or some of the really interesting ways of vetting sources that probably would have some issues getting through the publication review board. So that binds your hands a bit on some of those stories and maybe pushes you more towards the true fiction.
I think there's another iteration of this too that I think about a lot because I'm working on a novel, which is that you take a real event and you sort of...
Have you optioned it to anybody?
We can talk later.
You have to write it first.
Call my agent. You have to write it first. But like you sort of take a real event and you kind of reimagine it, right? So you take a period in history and say, well, what if things had gone a little bit differently? Or you just use it as kind of material that becomes like an inspiration or the subject matter broadly, and you
like
imagine
a Tarantino movie.
A new plot. Sure, yeah. And I think that's what's also so interesting about this genre is that the audience is familiar enough with the landscape of espionage. Now, granted, a lot of it may be misinformed by films they've seen that are kind of, like, well, it's not really like that. But the human element of the aspect of stealing secrets and the daring do and the intrigue and all of that, it creates enough terrain that you can sort of take something, and this is a lot of times what like ripped from the headlines shows like, CSI and whatever will do, and just take a recent event and kind of reimagine it. And I think that gives people places to hang on to it too. So that's like another form. And I have found in playing around with and writing fiction, you can often be more truthful than you can as a journalist. I mean, because, to your point, you got to keep digging. You have to find the facts. You may know or suspect things as a journalist, or even have things that somebody told you, but you can't tell it because you promised to keep it off the record. And in fiction, you can say it in a way that's not compromising.
That's right.
Or you can sort of make little bits of leaps and fill in the blanks that you can't always do with nonfiction. And it's incredibly liberating as a writer, I have to say.
Following Russia and what Russia's been doing to us, on subversion and sabotage, all these kind of crazy things and assassinations in dealing with our elections and all this kind of stuff. There's oftentimes journalists are stuck. They're like, we can't prove this, that, this, and the other happened. It's like, well, yeah, you can't prove in the sense that, you go to court and I actually can see Putin's signature giving it to whatever, but you have enough patterns, what they've done for years, you understand how this fits in, who's doing what, like you can know stuff. So if you're going to write fiction or write a movie, is essentially you can write the truth.
Yeah.
But it's not, you're not stuck with those things. I need to have 6 sources and I need to see the actual, I'm not going, the judge has to see the real thing. That
exactly. And I think that you get more, and I think you can actually in some ways make it more authentic of a story, because that you're able to then also imagine the human motivation and the human action and reaction in a way that is also very hard, frankly, as when we're trying to capture this in a piece of journalism, often because, the sources don't want to say very much, or they don't want to be quoted, or, they say, well, don't give away too much because it will reveal my identity. And in a news story, there's often like not as much room for dialogue. Obviously, you need like a magazine format to do that. But I think like for writers, just speaking for myself, and I'm sure like others like David Ignatius and people who've done both, or Daniel Silva would probably echo this, is that you kind of finally get to take everything that, as you put it, like, I know this is true, even though I can't prove it, and I can tell you a true story that it's like, it's expansive, and I can like exhale it.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do, and hope to get there. And some of it's, as you know, there's also in the espionage world, there's a lot of stuff that's come out, and there's books. You may be working on something now, but then eventually you write about it afterwards, where more people are willing to talk. And so you read that $1 Billion Spy, you read the stuff about the illegals, what's his name, Russians Among Us. You read those things and you're like, oh my God. At one point, I thought I knew the real secrets and no one else knew, and then here it is in book form.
Yeah. Well, David Hoffman, who did $1 Billion Spy, is great for that. Dead Hand is another just unbelievable book.
I don't think this. I have to look.
Yeah. So that was his book about the doomsday mechanism that the Russians had developed. That if they were wiped out by a nuclear strike, it was supposed to launch the missiles at the end.
Yeah,
and
I have to read that.
It's great stuff. So let's talk about some spy movies. So,
Sure.
All right. So do you have an all-time favorite spy movie, or like a short list? And we can define spy movie if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So usually the question is which ones are more realistic. Okay. So, but in terms of favorites, I like the ones that everybody else likes. I love all the Tom Clancy movies. I like the Le Carré movies. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Red October. All those things I really like those and feel good about those. If you want to move into ones that I like, which are more realistic, there's The Spy with Sacha Baron Cohen about, in sort of Syria. There's the Americans. We can talk about that separately. And then The Bureau, the French show.
Love The Bureau.
Yeah, which is, if anything, has more realistic feel than anything else. The Bureau is great because it's sort of in the office, the bureaucracy, the politics, people that go out to the field. It's dealing with, real issues that France and the United States and we are dealing with Russia and Syria and ISIS and all those other type of things. And so that one really
and it really is like the inner life of those characters too, and the psychology and the way that they're gaming each other and keeping things from one another. It is like, you said it's kind of an office drama, which is astonishing that it is as riveting as it actually is. The Bureau, it's
which
amazing.
is true. Like if you're talking about what's realistic with intelligence and spy work, most of our work is boring, right?
Yeah.
So we're writers. Like when you're overseas, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So yes, I get to go out and make sure I'm not under surveillance and spend hours and go in hiding and meet someone in an alley and pay them potentially or get specific information related to questions of the day and someone who has access. And so there's stuff that's sort of sexy and fun and on the street. But then I'm spending a ton of time writing up this stuff. What's the plan? What exactly happened? What was said? I didn't ask this question. I need to go back and get this thing answered. And so, it's a lot of in the office writing, sort of bureaucratic stuff. But also, that's if written well, that can be interesting too. And that's what the Bureau, I think, does.
But it does lead to the dilemma that I think a lot of former intelligence officers have. When we talk about spy movies, the most common reactions are, which ones suck the most? And the enjoyment question rarely comes up. Yeah. But being able to separate, I'm watching this as entertainment. I can watch the James Bond movies as entertainment, and that's perfectly fine. But as soon as there's someone else in the room who's an intelligence officer, you can't help but look at each other and roll your eyes when something happens. Not, of course, the jumping out of a helicopter and skiing down the mountain and shooting at people or climbing up the Eiffel Tower. Those things, it's pretty obvious. But the ones that are supposedly the realistic parts, and you still roll your eyes at them. But there's a way of doing it because there's still compelling human drama in office interactions. What about the personalities? And you've been in some of those arguments in those conference rooms where you have people screaming from a counterintelligence angle, we can't do this because we don't know X. And the other person saying, but we have Y and Z, that overrides X. And then the personalities come in. That's still compelling drama.
Totally.
Yeah.
And because the stakes are there too, right? I mean, if you know that, like, if it's a show about like the fate of this agent's life or the fate of this operation hinges on our ability to know whether we're being lied to, those are pretty good stakes. Yeah.
Exfiltration stories. I have not seen a lot of great exfiltration stories in movies.
But there's some that have been written. You read like McIntyre that writes these books, the British author. Yeah. He does a really good job of taking essentially known spy cases and putting them in a way that makes them really interesting to read.
And kind of repackaging and retelling them.
And there's a couple exfiltration, the Gordievsky story, for example. Right. They walk through that kind of stuff. But the one thing that I often don't see in movies, which should be something that they're really interested in, is just sort of, I remember director Hayden used to talk about our goal is to be as close to the border. Our job is to provide information, playing to the edge, right?
Chalk on the cleats.
Chalk on the cleats kind of stuff. And so you're dealing with moral, ethical dilemmas. And so often the public debate is, the right answer is clearly this or clearly that. And essentially, our world is essentially like, if I go this way, it creates this set of problems, right? And if I go that way, it creates that set of problems. And you can look at even some things that most people have already made decisions on, like we talk about, counterterrorism and strikes against terrorists and interrogation program and stuff. And you can put that down and you can explain to people where, if you walk them through things and then they're like, okay, what's the decision? They're like, there isn't a really easy decision. But in our world, you got to make the decision, right? And so make it, and you're going to get a problem from this side saying this is wrong, or a problem from the other side saying.
Now that can be hard to write. Writing up an ethical dilemma where there is no good choice, there are only bad choices, but you still have to choose. That can be done. But it's difficult, and I wonder if that's why so many spy movies, even the good ones, even some of the Le Carré ones that we tend to like, so many of them revolve around one of two tropes. One is the rogue officer or rogue operation. Yeah. I don't know about you, but in my shorter than yours career, I didn't have a lot of senior officers running divisions who were doing secret plots to assassinate analysts overseas because they came across their plot to overthrow a government that was off the books. It just doesn't happen that often.
Often.
Right?
Doesn't happen at all.
There you go.
Again, it's a centralized bureaucracy. Essentially everything, is, there's mistakes made and there's things that happen, but the rogue organization or the rogue officer is
so common.
Not
Mission Impossible movies.
There's people there's bad actors who do criminal acts and do the wrong thing, but hopefully they get caught in things. But it's not. Yeah.
But
who run their operations and they run them tightly, but they're their operations. They're sanctioned, right? I mean, it's like
So that's one trope. The other trope that bugs me is, it seems like before you establish a movie franchise about a spy organization or operation with the same team. Instead of establishing what they can do and why they're so good, Mission Impossible has to start with a mole. It's always the mole. And yes, there's compelling human drama in mole stories. Le Carré did it perhaps better than anyone. But if it's either a mole or a rogue operation, you're actually leaving behind a lot of those compelling ethical dilemmas you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's fair.
Speaking of ethics, I'm going to put my vote on the table for favorite spy movie.
Oh, please, go ahead.
The Lives of Others.
Oh, fantastic.
Such a great
Absolutely
movie.
fantastic.
Such a great movie. This is a movie also that transcends the genre.
You don't have to like spy movies to like that movie.
It's incredible.
So
it's incredible.
East Germany and
Yeah, exactly.
that whole living under surveillance. What is it like to live in a police state?
Yeah, and follows the guy who is the one who is the monitor. He's spying on this couple, and I'm not going to give it away for people because it gets into the human drama is profound in this. But that always struck me, in addition to just being this incredibly moving, heartbreaking at times story, as one that was also highly accurate insofar as that you had now about a different intelligence service, right? One that was a true police state, the Stasi in East Germany, but where the entire apparatus was organized around collecting intelligence on people who were threats to the state. It was systematized, it was routinized, it was bureaucratic, it was arbitrary, oppressive, hidden, and they captured all of that in this very intimate, small kind of movie. And that always struck me as one that it was just pulling in all of these human dimensions into a story about really 3 or 4 people.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And you think about that because even in those kind of states, there's people who have, that might make the right ethical thing, or people are people, and so there's all those sort of feelings. So I can imagine, I was in Moscow, and I had video and audio in my house, and I had people tracking me all the time. And there was a couple times where, I would run across my surveillance by mistake. Vagary of sort of movements. I'd end up in an elevator with one of my guys, and he'd be looking at me, and we're sort of quiet going down as the elevator's going down, and he'd be like, "I was there when you bought your dog." And I'll go, "Oh, it's we're watching you like," and one of them is like, "You drive a little bit too fast. You should slow down." Like, "Okay, thanks. It really helps." And I remember one time I was going across a big boulevard in Moscow, and a light changed, and I drove across, and a car came flying through and hit my car, and it was a student at Lumumba University, and there was there's policemen at all the corners, that they're sort of standing out there. And so this guy got out and started going on and on about how I had gone through the light and this and that, and the policeman was taking it on. But I had surveillance cars follow me. So my surveillance car just pulled over, and they were standing on the sidewalk, and eventually the policeman looks over, and the surveillance guy goes like, "Come over here." And so the policeman comes over, walks back out, grabs the other guy, and takes him away. It's like, because essentially that guy had gone through a red light and hit me, but he was starting in with, I had done something wrong. But the surveillance had seen the whole thing, and
they were your witness.
They may hate me, and they may follow me, and they may see us as, political enemies, but, they knew.
They had your back. They're like, no, it was not John's fault.
Yeah, we'll get him for something else, but he didn't do this one.
Yeah. David, do you have a favorite that you want to put on the table?
Yeah, like you started out, it depends on how you define it.
Yeah.
So
the
true
pure movies about espionage, let's say.
The pure spy movies, the man who came in from the cold is just one of the best.
Yeah.
The Spy Who Came In From
It's
the Cold.
great. It's great. Great book and great film.
The true story ones, not the full fiction ones, but I like both Argo and Breach for different reasons.
Yeah.
But both of them have the human drama. For Argo, what captured me about that, it could have been developed better in the film, but I think it worked, was you have Tony Mendez going into Iran and having a very limited amount of time to teach cover to these people who have never had any training for it, and to tell them what do they need. They need to reflexively know their name, their background. They need to walk and talk differently. And very limited scenes in the movie of that, but very compelling, of these people who are already at a stress level most of us can never imagine. And suddenly they have to shift their personality and become someone else in order to execute the operation. And I found that was good. And then, of course, Breach, the story of essentially catching Robert Hansen at the FBI, and just the personal dynamic with Hansen played brilliantly in that movie. Chris Cooper, I think.
Chris Cooper.
Yeah, that makes me angry, though, because I was in the middle of the whole Hansen thing. In fact, I was there when he was arrested, and it was we had FBI guys working with us inside CIA, and to capture Hansen, and it was there's a ton of stories there that still need to be told, and I hope we can make films out of these kind of things. But I said it makes me angry, but they did a nice job of figuring out a way in. So they took this young officer who happened to be put in with Hansen in his office, who supposedly, but having been in the middle of that and sort of running that case with a number of other people, that guy was essentially completely tangential. He had nothing to do with catching Hansen. He had no idea of what we were doing or how. He was just a young officer who just was sort of asked to babysit and then report back to them. But so movie-wise, they did the right thing. It was a great way in.
That's the Ryan Philippe
If you were involved in the thing, you're like, well, how come that guy?
Because it wasn't a documentary.
He wasn't. Yeah, exactly.
Can I tell? I got to tell a Hansen story.
Yeah.
So this is years ago, but knew a guy who had just retired. Was a senior operations officer. I'm sure you guys probably both know him. And he was out in Colorado. This is to tell you something about story when he was still in, and he had been out in Colorado with the Supermax. And as he's getting ready to leave, like his prison escort is like, "So you want to see Hansen?" And he's like, "You want me to show him to me?" He's like, "Yeah, you want to see him in the cell?" And he's like, "Can I go back in my car and get my sidearm?" As a joke. And he's kind of half joke. And he's like, "No, come with me." So he says, he does the story. He tells them that he takes them to Hansen's cell, where he's, I guess, he's in isolation. He's in solitary. And they slide open the door, the little window view on the door, and he lets them look in at him. And he said he's just pacing back and forth across the cell, like a caged animal. And he was just like, "Good."
Yeah.
And that was it. And I was like, that was quite a moment. But yeah, want to come down and see the guy? Least favorites. I'm going to throw my least favorite out.
Okay.
Well, maybe not one of my least favorites. A movie that I saw and I lived through this story in my own way too was Snowden. Oliver Stone's Snowden.
Yeah, I haven't watched it.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
It's just, look, it's going to be a divisive movie because it's about a divisive character. But it was just so utterly paranoid and, incredibly one-sided, which is not to say I'm not taking a side, but this is a multi-dimensional character here.
Glenn Greenwald's involved, it's going to be bad.
Yeah, I did not even see that.
It was just very dramatically unsatisfying.
I just saw that as essentially propaganda, and that to me isn't as fun to watch. Similarly,
but Citizen4, Laura Poitras' documentary, which also has a very strong point of view, is a great movie. It's riveting.
All right, so I have to watch both of them.
I think it'll make people who worked in the NSA nuts because it is holding up Snowden as a hero, but it's just so much more dramatically well constructed and interesting and more tense. And there are moments
the US government did such a poor job of dealing with the Snowden thing. There's so much there that if it was. Yeah, the government is often bad at these things, right? But yeah, okay, so I got to watch those things.
Yeah, it's also, and it's like, and he's just, I don't know, the character, the way they developed the character is just, it was just, I did not like Snowden. I didn't like it at all.
Interesting.
I'm with you. I mentioned earlier, I just hate the tropes of the mole hunts or the rogue operator or often the rogue whole agency. And so any movie with those in them, I find it hard to love.
If it comes in with a clear point of view. So I didn't see the one, there's one about a Guantanamo guy.
Was this the Jodie Foster movie?
Mauritanian or whatever?
The Mauritanian.
I don't want to get into it here, but I know people who spend a lot of time with that guy. And if they sat here with you and explain and talked it through, you'd be like, the guy's as guilty as can possibly be. But the story is told as like, oh my God, this poor innocent guy, because he's personable and interesting and speaks good English and he meets with it and he talks things through and you're like, oh, this poor guy's been treated bad. He's completely, taken with, but anybody that knows the details and have spent time and walks you through it, you'd be like, oh my God, yeah. So, but the movie comes in with a point of view, which sometimes is okay because it tells a story, right?
Well, it sounds like it's like it would be like what critics would say, like, oh, typical liberal Hollywood treatment of of a subject. Maybe that's what some people would call it. But I actually want to bring it.
But I'm kind of liberal.
Okay, so I'm curious, going back to Rob Reiner. That's somebody who's walking in with a point of view about everything, famously. So was that uncomfortable for you when he's asking you to sit down and talk about this? Did he seem like he had his mind made up about what the story he wanted to tell?
Well, I'm sure he had his mind made up, but his questions to professionals like General Hayden and Clinton were, what does this mean? What is that? And we could explain things in a non-political sort of clear way. So, yeah, He definitely came in hoping that what we would say would validate what he believes, and it sort of probably did. But our goal wasn't that. And I wasn't going to answer, I'll answer truthfully to things. I'm not going to say, because your point of view is this, I'm going to then play along with that.
Yeah. To expand the genre just a little bit, we've talked around this with the Tom Clancy series. Spy movies that are nominally spy movies, but really they're action adventure movies, and that kind of is largely the genre.
Yeah,
although I have to say,
and all that stuff.
yeah, all that stuff. Although I think because of streaming, and you've had like some of the Le Carre, books made, like Night Manager and Little Drummer Girl, and other things have been made into like true espionage. But if we have to go into that category, do you have you like the Clancy movies? Do you have a favorite Clancy movie?
What's the one where they're in Latin America and they
It's
got
Clear
the
and
drug
Present
thing?
Danger.
Yeah.
It's Iran Contra.
Yeah, I like that. I like
It's
that
basically Iran Contra.
one. Yeah,
right?
that's true. I like that. I like Red October. I mean, I liked most of the Clancy movies. The Clancy show I thought was crappy.
Oh,
Or at least the first season was okay. Second season was just
and there are Clancy
ridiculous.
video games, and I mean,
Yeah, I'm sure it's an industry in its own, and so there's probably good and bad stuff in there. But the movies, it's still enjoyable to watch them. You can turn them back on, and
yeah, you can they're compulsively watchable.
Yeah.
Fun, Clear and Present Danger story. Okay. So John Poindexter, who I know well and wrote a book about years ago, was at an event. This was after he had, gone through his, as he said, the Iran Contra business, as he likes to call it. And he's at this event at the Naval Academy, where of course he graduated, top of his class. Plug for a great book, by the way, called The Nightingale Song,
Yes,
which is
I have
begging
it.
to
It's
be
great.
made into a film at some
That's a
point
good
by
point.
the late Bob Timberg, who's
I got to write that down.
who's great. I work with his son now, actually, at the
All right.
Post. So Poindexter is sitting at this table, and Clancy's on the other side. And I guess Poindexter's pretty quiet and pretty reserved. Like, he's not a showboater kind of guy. And I guess Clancy is just kind of like holding court, and it's Tom Clancy, and I'm here at the Naval Academy. And he sees him across the table, and he says, "Admiral Poindexter, I just wanted you to," says in front of everybody, "just wanted you to know, I totally did not base Clear and Present Danger on you and Iran Contra." And Poindexter's just like,
Sure.
like, there's
said a little
literally
too
a
much.
national security advisor trying to delete emails about the covert support for Latin American rebels. And but it's
Just a coincidence.
just a coincidence. Just a coincidence. My favorite, by the way, in this category would definitely be Hunt for Red October,
Yeah, that's great.
which is actually my favorite movie of all time. I really, honestly, I will go to the mat with this. I think The Hunt for Red October is a perfect screenplay. I can find very few things wrong with it. I can recite that movie backwards.
Well, you can
and
tell you're
forwards.
into it if you know the screenplay.
I mean, it's
Right.
just like, it's amazing. And I remember when the movie came out, though, it had this, I think it must have come out, I can't remember if the Soviet Union had fallen or not, but the Berlin Wall, I think, had come down.
yeah.
And you'll remember the movie starts with, it's showing the map, and it's like, like the quick introductory text and all that. And basically it says, in the days of Glasnost, before Gorbachev came to power, and it tells you this quick little thing, like there was a submarine that went out. It says, and according to the U.S. Navy, everything you're about to see never happened. And so it, of course, sets
What
you
a
up
great
with
way to set it
such
up.
a great way to set it up, of being like, this is a story, but officially no one will tell it. And the story I'd always heard, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, is that Clancy writes this book. The U.S. Naval Institute Press publishes it.
Yeah.
Like, it's published by a
small
small
publisher,
publishing
yeah.
house, like an academic publishing house, which Bob Timberg used to work for. He ran proceedings for a while. And the story I've always heard is that, like, Reagan finds his way to it and is, like, photographed, like,
Yes.
carrying it, and so
Right.
that adds its popularity.
Yeah,
But that,
I heard that too.
But that I guess that people in the NSC or maybe in the Navy came to Clancy and said, "How the hell do you know all this?
Yeah,
Like, where did you get this stuff?" And he said, "It's just all in your archives. I just did the research." And they're looking at him like, "Okay."
We didn't realize how much we
Like, what
declassified.
did we put out there? But to me, it's also just like, it's such a great, it's just such a great cat and mouse story.
Well, one of the
great
things,
performances.
similar sort of thing we've been trying to work with, we optioned a book on the Glomar Explorer story. And I think people have tried to
Great.
bring that to a movie for years. And we worked with a really good, the guy did Highlander and a number of things to try pitch that around, and we haven't had success. And I'm like, I don't get it. I can see that as a big
Oh, yeah.
movie. I don't know, for people who know the story, it's about the CIA, bringing up a Soviet sub that had gone to a nuclear sub that had gone to the bottom, 3.5 miles deep in the Pacific, and the Soviets lost it and were searching for it, and the U.S. Navy and the Americans found it and essentially using Howard Hughes as a cover for.
You can't make this up.
It's
And
amazing.
Created a special ship that was supposed to look like a deep sea mining, for nodules on the bottom of the ocean. Ship essentially created this big giant claw that would go down and pick this massive submarine up and bring it up into the belly of this star. I mean, it's an incredible,
and the vessel
story.
Was called the Glomar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the Glomar. That's where the Glomar, what's the word? Afterwards, like you can either confirm it or deny.
Yeah, that's the classic response to a Freedom of Information Act request. You got Glomar'd. We can neither confirm nor deny that the records you seek exist.
Yeah.
It's actually a point of pride to get Glomar'd as a journalist. It's like, I know I'm onto something.
John, have you ever heard someone explain to you why they haven't made that movie, others that you've talked to in Hollywood? Because that is one of those cases where you think it should have been done.
Well, there's a number of them. We also had the book for the Stars on the Wall at the agency, Book of Honor and stuff.
Oh, the Ted Gupp book.
And there's some great stories in there, and we still might be able to take individual ones and see if we can't make those into shows. But of course, the book itself, the problem is everybody dies, and so everybody's like, well, we can't. How do we make a show where everybody?
Well, you can
go back to when they died.
You can. It's called Rogue One, which is an underappreciated spy movie in the sci-fi genre, but it's inherently a
Star Wars movie?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, because it's about the spies who steal the Death Star.
It's the
planes.
operation to get to the Death Star plans, and it involves spying, and one of the lead characters is ostensibly a rebel intelligence officer, although it's largely paramilitary. It's a good movie from that perspective, even if you don't know the Star Wars universe. But guess what? Spoiler alert for everybody who isn't already familiar with Star Wars movies. Virtually everyone dies at the end, and yet it's still a great movie.
And that's alluded to in the very first Star Wars film, Episode 4, when they show the plans and they say many rebel intelligence officers died bringing us this information. And everyone's like, oh. And then they go on with it. But it's kind of like, it's very.
See, I knew you guys were nerds. I knew you guys.
We were going to get there.
So that's one of
you were done before the minute you walked in.
Let me go to your question, though. Like, why things don't get made. And it's, I guess it's not surprising. It has to do with sort of risk tolerance and things. It's surprising, how many people we talk to and walk through stories, and you think this is a slam dunk, this is easy, and people are like, and they've got to brief it to maybe their seniors and whatever. Is essentially, it's not surprising. There's big money in this, so people are making big bets and spending a lot of money to make a movie, and nobody wants to be the one that says yes to something and then have that fail, and that's a big stain on their thing. And so it's almost easier. That's why you see so many, Superman, or Spider-Man 15 or whatever. It's like, okay, I know if I say yes to this, it might be bad, but I'm going to make money because they all make money. And so there's sort of this risk, like something new, something different, to say yes to it can be a really sort of bold, risky type of thing. Like when I talk about Chernobyl, for example, someone who said yes to that was actually like probably putting their job at risk. Like, hey, this could be awful, and I'm going to be the one held responsible for it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it was a great hit. And so there's a lot of that, and a lot of people you talk to, like I guess probably in any industry, is they act as if they know the right answer. We're looking for this. We're not looking for that. There's not an interest in period pieces now. We're not interested in World War II thing. We're not interested. And essentially, they're just sort of making that up. Like there's no real data behind these things. There's not it's almost a feel, and who was it? Was it Goldman or whatever said, nobody in Hollywood knows anything, but right? It's sort of, so you're gambling. It's a risk thing. And so lots of stuff that you and I might say this clearly would be good. It gets turned down. But
is people's appetite for risk changed because there are these streaming platforms now? Like, you take a show like a Mayor of Easttown or something. I don't know how much money it made, and how I guess you measure that maybe by subscriptions to HBO Max or something. But like those movies and those shows aren't going to make the money that a Spider-Man franchise is going to make, but all of the top talent wants to do it because it's prestige drama and it's great and it brings in subscribers. So has that kind of changed the dynamic?
I think studios and others, they want some prestige things to win awards, but they also want things that make big money. But the industry's really gone through sort of a sport has been smacked. So COVID then added to it. So as streaming came, it sort of pushed into the business and sort of made movies harder to justify. Then COVID hit, right? And the cost of has changed the industry, but the big player that changed it was Netflix. So Netflix changed the whole. So Netflix came and said, Shane, this is a great story you have. It's wonderful. We're going to pay you this much of money, but we own it, right? So you can come to them. They may give you a good chunk of money, but if this is the greatest show in the history of mankind, you're not getting any back end. Whereas it used to be that was all part of the thing. It's like, okay, you're going to get paid here. Depends. You're going to get a piece of the budget. You're going to get the back end. Yeah. You're going to have residuals, blah, blah. I don't even know what residuals means. But Netflix came and said, nope, we're big. we're going to pay you one bit of money. If it stinks, great, you made some good money. If it's amazing, sorry, it's ours, we'll own it. And so that's changed a lot. So there's a lot of big players that knew how the industry worked, and the studios don't have the same kind of control like they used to. They're almost like just big banks now. They're not like a place you go to and makes the whole kind of thing. And so I think the industry is going through a big sort of shift and change.
The other thing that's interesting and different there too is that you can take, I think Squid Game, which I've not seen, is a good example of this. My understanding from talking to somebody who knows this is that Netflix basically spent nothing marketing them. The algorithm kind of found it. Mm-hmm. It became popular. It surfaces on the platform. It becomes like the biggest show they've ever done. So now you have that possibility too, where someone makes a show that maybe no one will ever see, and then everyone sees it because it just takes off, and they've built a content algorithm that can see where something is percolating. Yep. They grab it, they spend nothing to promote it, and they push it.
They've got all these foreign places where they might be Netflix India is making separate money that never shows up here, but they're doing really well. And so there's now companies around trying to do what Netflix does. So Netflix, they control and they see all that data. They can see whether you looked at something, and if you scrolled and looked at it, what was your chance of you then looked at, how long would you look at it? If you looked at the first episode but didn't go further, like they can start to pull all that together and put that kind of stuff together. So the beginning of the big data piece in Hollywood. Now companies are trying to come in. And so even with some of the things we've done, we've talked to some people like, okay, you have this story about a spy case in India. We're gonna sell it this way as a romantic thing, and this way as with an American twist, and this way as an Indian. We're going to put this fake thing up, and we're going to see how many people click on it. And the people click on it, how many say buy. And if you buy, it'll say, oh, it's not ready yet. And so we can start to pull that data in to say, okay, let's make this more this way or that way. And so there's a lot of that stuff going on as people try to mitigate risk, I guess.
It's interesting, though, because I think that model will push towards lower budget movies overall. Mm-hmm. That is... I don't see Netflix wanting to invest in the $200, $300 million movie the way obviously the Avengers will in the series or Star Wars will. And maybe that's a good thing because a lot of those do end up relying on the tropes. So if you're going to have a spy movie, what do you have to have? You have to have a big car chase. Well, we know if there's a car chase with a shootout, something has gone horribly wrong and you're not going to be a good intelligence officer the rest of your career. Whereas in these, that's considered a sign of success if you survive the car chase and kill enough people. For me, that's why I put Ronin on this list of a great movie. Yeah, I love Ronin. I like Ronin. The car chase is actually one of the better car chase sequences I can recall. And yet for me, I still do the eye roll of, oh, really? You're gonna do that again? But if you're going to do it, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, the number of stars who will also do something as a prestige project and potentially, I would guess, take less money for it because they really love the show and they really just want to get behind it.
If they're into it, or they want to do some things to make money, but they want to win some awards. On the other hand, it's like there's
it's and this is something. It's a system that has long been driven by the stars, but the changing platforms and the appetite for stories. I mean, it just creates so many more avenues now, which I applaud. And
at that level, when you have an actor who's established, they can do that. I mean, we know a former...
There's only a few, yeah.
We know a former intelligence officer. He worked with De Niro, who wanted to make The Good Shepherd. De Niro wasn't interested in making the most money on that movie. He wanted that story to be told. He wanted to be a part of it. And in fact, had the officer in one of the scenes in the movie. But you can do that when you're De Niro. Mm-hmm. You can't do that when you're an up-and-coming actor who may have some sway in Hollywood, but you kind of need to ratchet that next one in so you can keep your career going.
David, should we ask John a question from the Chatterbox?
Yes. One of the things we do here is we have the so-called Chatterbox, which has within it a number of questions, which we pull out randomly and ask our guests. So let's reach in the Chatterbox. We've already hit some of these inadvertently. What common misperception about your profession or specialty makes your blood boil?
I feel like our whole conversation's been about this.
Well, my profession and your profession was essentially a secret one, so we should not be surprised that there are misperceptions, right? So in an open society, a secret organization is going to be one where people can place all sorts of views or political views or things. And, you and I, all of us see this on Twitter, right? So it's amazing some of the people who will come after you thinking that you're like this baby killer or, all kinds of crazy things. And, sometimes when I get sort of snotty at it, I'm like, well, luckily you live in a country where the people who work at the CIA are going to be working day and night to keep you safe, whether you like them or not. So, I think people forget that these institutions are manned by people, many smart people, many people who came in through sort of rigorous process. Like any group of people, some are more talented and less talented than others. Some of them, more ethical and less ethical than others, even though we, I think, try pretty hard to be very serious and very scrupulous about those kind of things, very strong sort of regulations. And so I think when people oversimplify things and assume things are either all bad or all great too, like acting like, oh, you guys are heroes. Well, no, we're doing a job, and I think we're doing it professionally and well. But that doesn't mean we're also, like you said, at the edge, and we're dealing with people and countries and change their mind. Like we're talking about Putin and Ukraine. Does Putin even know what he's going to do, whether he's going to invade or not? And so you see this thing, the CIA got this wrong. It's like, I feel like saying, who's going to win the election next time? Like, we have more data. You have a completely open system. You have every bit of information at your fingertips. Nobody predicts the future well, because the world is complex. And so, to assume that that's the CIA's job to figure out where the world is going, essentially we're doing the best with what we can to try to get, a little bit of value add. And that's the sort of best that can happen. So it's sort of the simplification that bothers me. It's like, it's all good or all bad. Like, listen, you got people working hard, people make mistakes, the world's complex. You're going to have successes and failures.
Mm-hmm. That's one profession or specialty. But now your specialty is in the movie making business. So what is a misperception about that business that even in the last few years you've come to be annoyed by?
Wow. I guess the notion that that there's just big money in it, or it's easy. Like I think, if you hit, but that's not unusual, and I shouldn't have been surprised by that, because essentially it's been like that forever. People make their way to Hollywood thinking they're going to be stars or make a bunch of money, and oftentimes most of the times it's shattered dreams, and not the case. It's just it's a much slower, longer business. I mean, even if you put in the time, we've been doing this for three and a half years now, and we're having quote unquote success, and we've signed things, we have movies going forward, but we haven't made money. Like, until something gets made, distributed, and out there, does money come in? And so luckily we have a little bit of investment, so we can sort of put food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you love the work, it sounds
like. It's fun. It's creative. It's fun. It's really interesting. We meet smart and interesting people in a different thing, but we're still talking about the world that I, came from. We can deal with, you're a writer, you're doing a book. I can talk to you guys. Yeah. When I was in the agency, I not once ever spoke to a journalist, ever. And now that I'm out, it's you guys that are the most interesting, because you sort of live the same life.
Yes.
You're interested in the issues. You oftentimes are overseas. You try to understand cultures. You try to dig into things. And so in many ways, dealing with journalists is sort of a more natural thing for someone who came out of the intelligence business. And it's the same with these writers and creative people. Like I like being around smart, creative, interesting people who are just interested in the issues. It's people who don't care. Those are the ones I'm not interested in dealing with.
Yeah. Well, John Sipher, this has been super fun. Thank you for coming in here. It's been great for all three of us to be together.
Absolutely.
And we will look forward to eventually seeing one of your movies up on the big or the small screen.
I'll get you guys involved somehow, either through your content, or we'll get you out there as an expert in some fashion.
We look forward to it.
And definitely get us VIP.
And Alex let us down. I just want to make that very, very clear.
Well, and you got to pay for the dinner, because we don't want to have the experience of working with you and having to pay for ourselves.
You are definitely paying for the dinner.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
All right, my pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.